Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. We have had prowlers in our city for some time now, and not one has been taken into custody. They've even attacked women and gotten away with it. Now, we have a maniac loose in our vicinity using gas. And we all know there are lives at stake. Although we have, or are supposed to have, police protection. Where is our police protection? These bone-chilling words from Art Thompson's letter to the editor convey a sense of palpable fear, of anger, and bewilderment hanging at the end of every sentence. His plea is clear, but the solution remains elusive. How can the prowlers who stalk a community under the cover of darkness finally be caught? The initial response was quick. Increased police patrols, vigilante groups armed and ready to shoot first and ask questions later, and even assistance from the State Bureau of Investigation. But the so-called prowler remained at large, eluding capture during a harrowing 2-week ordeal in Mattoon, Illinois. Though the story spread quickly across America and even around the world, it was soon overshadowed by the waning months of the Second World War. Yet for the people of Mattoon, the strange events of late summer 1944 lingered. And for those in the growing fields of psychology and sociology, the incident would take on a life of its own, becoming a case study in what's now known as mass hysteria. But as we'll discover, there are many layers to this unsettling tale. It's a perfect example of how a small spark of fear can ignite a wildfire of panic, engulfing an entire community almost overnight. This case has been studied, dissected, and debated so many times that it's hard to keep track of all the players. Yet, despite countless theories, nearly every researcher ends with the same conclusion. Nothing has been definitively proven or disproven. It remains a mystery. In today's episode, we'll explore the facts and context of this bizarre event, digging into the original newspaper reports and weighing the 4 most prominent theories: an industrial leak, mass hysteria, an actual perpetrator, or something paranormal. We don't aim to solve this mystery. Instead, we want to look at why it has captured imaginations for so long, and why it continues to baffle investigators even today. By the end, it will be up to you to decide how much of the story is grounded in fact, and how much is simply wild speculation fueled by fear. But before we get to that, I've got a little secret to share. While we haven't officially announced it yet, tickets for our free tour, Spooky Secrets of Yonge Street in Toronto, are available right now on our website, hauntedwalk.com. This special tour will run on select nights in October, focusing on the area around College Park, a place we don't usually explore on our original Haunted Walk of Toronto. You'll hear new ghost stories and uncover dark history that we've never shared before. Tickets are limited, and since they're free, we expect them to go quickly. So grab yours now while it's still under the radar. And if you've been eyeing our new ghost tour in Kingston aboard the SS Keewatin, don't wait too long on those either. They are selling extremely quickly, and I would hate to see you miss out. These are, of course, just the beginning. We have over 20 different spine-tingling paranormal adventures for you this spooky season across Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, featuring pioneer villages, haunted museums, cemeteries, and all sorts of other spooky places. Make your plans, book early, and join us for an unforgettable October. If you would like a personal recommendation from me, feel free to drop me an email at jim@hauntedwalk.com. The city of Mattoon is a community located in central Illinois. Its population over the past 100 years has remained relatively stable, just over 15,000 people inhabiting the city proper, with plenty more from the surrounding agricultural settlements coming in and out daily to go to school, work, do their shopping, and enjoy local entertainment. Mattoon's growth surged with the arrival of the railroad, thanks to its strategic location on the key north-south and east-west routes. The city became a vital transportation corridor, linking the bustling metropolis of Chicago to the fertile agricultural lands of mid and southern Illinois. Since the 19th century, farming, manufacturing, and transportation have been the backbone of the city, whose fortunes have risen and fallen with those industries. Many would call this type of place sleepy and quiet, but the city is accustomed to tragedy. The most devastating thing to happen in Mattoon was a massive F4 tornado that killed over 100 people in the area in 1917. Still one of the deadliest tornadoes in the state's history. Despite the widespread damage, the city quickly rebounded and kept chugging along as a typical Midwestern small city, a place where you knew your neighbors and looked out for one another. But soon, another tragic event was about to shake this community to its core. It was the midst of the Second World War. Yet in 1944, Mattoon still resembled a typical American Midwest city. Sure, many of its young men were off fighting overseas, and others had temporarily moved to larger cities to aid in the war effort, but life in Mattoon carried on. The community contributed in its own way, mainly through manufacturing and agriculture. 1944 did mark a pivotal shift in the war. The D-Day landings had been a success just a few months earlier, and Allied forces were making rapid advances across Western Europe. New Allied victories and liberations from Nazi rule were reported daily, and optimism ran high, and morale across America was on the upswing. Local newspapers reflected this triumphant mood with bold headlines like "Yanks in Germany by Nightfall," which was splashed across the top of the Mattoon Daily Journal on September 2nd. But right below that celebratory line was something much more sinister, which read, "Anesthetic prowler on the loose. Mrs. Kearney and daughter, first victims." The story recounted the truly terrifying experience of a mother and daughter who described a gas attack in their homes as they peacefully slept. According to Mrs. Kearney, she smelled a sweet odor in her bedroom shortly before realizing her body was paralyzed and that she was unable to move. She assumed someone was in her home, possibly trying to rob her, or worse. By the time help arrived, the prowler was nowhere to be seen. That is, until Mr. Kearney, who was out working as a taxi driver, came home to assist his wife. He spotted someone lurking outside, peeking in the bedroom window, looking poised to strike again. Although he gave chase, the prowler got away. Mrs. Kearney would recover from the ordeal, but she described a lingering and very sore and dry throat. The Kearneys were able to describe the attacker, a slender man in dark clothing wearing a tight hat. A description that would become iconic in the coming weeks. Although this story was the first reported to the media, and the sinister headline remarked that it was the first attack, as if implying more were to come, earlier stories eventually emerged. It seemed that the so-called anesthetic prowler had been stalking and attacking others long before Mrs. Kearney had her terrifying encounter. Another woman, Mrs. Brown, and her children had apparently experienced a very similar thing, awaking in the middle of the night to a sickly sweet gas smell, experiencing paralysis and being helpless to move, and not feeling quite right for days afterwards. Mrs. Brown originally decided not to report the matter to the police, thinking it was so fantastical that people wouldn't believe her. Months later, as she read Mrs. Kearney's account in the paper, she decided it was time to come forward, convinced the same thing had happened to her. Mrs. Brown wasn't alone. Urban Rafe and his wife had the exact same feeling and recounted their experience, which had occurred only the night before the Kearneys. They woke up, smelled something that appeared to be gas, before feeling dizzy and sick, with the sensation that their limbs were paralyzed. In the very same article, Mrs. Ryder claims she had this precise experience only hours before Mrs. Kearney. That's at least 3 separate incidents of supposed gas poisoning before the iconic headline kicked off the panic. Were the other 3 simply using hindsight to explain something strange that had happened to them? Perhaps they were intent on causing mass fear, or just wanted some attention. Or was there something really sinister going on in Mattoon? Suddenly, reports of the mad gasser exploded. Each day, more people came forward with eerily similar experiences in and around the city. By the nights of September 5th and 6th, the city had reached a fever pitch. Multiple gas-related attacks, a growing list of victims, and no plausible explanation. The perpetrator left few traces, vanishing without a sound, except for one curious case. During Beulah Cord's attack, she stepped outside to find a stained cloth lying on her porch. When she picked it up and sniffed it, she was immediately struck by a terrible dizziness. Later, while searching outside, she discovered a nearly empty tube of lipstick and a skeleton key, objects she was certain hadn't been there before. These 3 items were some of the only physical clues ever found during the Gasser's 2-week reign of terror, suggesting that a prowler might indeed be behind the attacks. The story reached its peak on September 7th, with a bold front-page headline, "Mad Anesthetist Strikes Again." For the first time, the Mad Gasser appeared above any wartime updates. It had become the city's biggest news. According to the report, the Gasser had struck at least 2 more homes the previous night. However, further investigation suggested the number could be as high as 6 separate homes targeted on September 6th alone. In what had become an almost predictable pattern, victims like Ardell Spangler and Laura Junkin described the same disturbing symptoms: a sickly sweet odor, temporary paralysis, and a scratchy throat. The details were eerily consistent, only with different victims on different nights. In that same article, the chief of police hinted at a possible explanation: nerves. He suggested that the women had become so caught up in the media frenzy that they were experiencing psychosomatic symptoms, phantom effects brought on by fear rather than an actual attack. It was a daring explanation. As you might imagine, it didn't sit well with the community. Still, the police held their official line. Just days later, the chief doubled down, stating there was no evidence of this so-called Gasser and urging people to calm down, claiming it was all a massive case of mistaken identity and overactive imaginations. Despite dismissing the situation as mere hysteria, both police and citizens took action. Special brigades were formed to patrol the streets in search of the elusive culprit, and representatives from the State Bureau of Investigation made several visits to try to track down the perpetrator. Yet for all the effort and heightened fear, nothing was ever found. The increased attention on the case did have one noticeable effect. The number of reported incidents dropped dramatically. While the media remained frenzied in the second week, the stories were far fewer. Updates focused on the search efforts, now at a standstill, and the police doubling down on their theory that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. The official line became clear. There was no Mad Gasser, just some wartime fumes that had caused the women to overreact. As the attacks waned, search parties disbanded, the story slowly started to fade from the headlines. By mid-September, no further victims had come forward, and the attention shifted back to the war effort. Over the years, the story has been revived from time to time, mainly by those studying mass hysteria and its strange effects. To many, it's the perfect case study of how fear and anxiety can manifest as phantom physical symptoms. But for others, the case endures because of its mysterious elements, where no single explanation seems to perfectly fit. Now that we've heard the known facts about this case, let's look into the 4 explanations that others have put forward. The first, that the gas was very real, but came from pollution or some other source. 2, nothing about this was real, and it was fueled by mass hysteria. 3, an actual gasser did exist, but went undetected and stopped. And 4, some paranormal entity was responsible and moved on before it could be caught. You'll recall the Chief of Police, C.E. Cole, was quick to latch onto the hoax narrative. He was also the first to propose the gas from another source theory. As early as September 12, 1944, just 10 days after the first attack was reported, Cole boldly declared the case effectively solved, calling it a mistake from beginning to end. His explanation? A large concentration of gas had drifted over from the nearby diesel engine plant, which was running at maximum capacity for the war effort. Cole reassured the public that a gas leak could cause the strange symptoms and even stained cloth, potentially explaining the evidence found at the court's attack. But the diesel engine plant's owners swiftly responded. There were only 5 gallons of noxious gas in their facility, nowhere near enough to waft through Mattoon and cause these serious effects. Notably, workers at the plant, who were in much closer proximity to the gases, weren't affected by these symptoms. According to the plant owners, there was no way the fumes from their facility were responsible for the types of attacks people were experiencing. Just because that particular plant wasn't the source of the gas doesn't mean industrial pollution couldn't have played a role. This was the Second World War after all, and production was in overdrive. Pollution levels were undoubtedly high. It's possible that some type of leakage, whether airborne or in the local water supply, could have poisoned parts of this community. But the theory raises more questions than answers. Why were only a handful of people affected? Why did the incidents occur in waves at night, often targeting a few individuals in a household while leaving others untouched? And if industrial pollution was suspected, why weren't people better prepared? Gas masks were common at the time, and the public knew how to use them, so it would have been simple enough to warn residents of possible poisoning. While initially promising, this theory ultimately doesn't quite hold up. Let's move on to the most widely accepted theory, mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is a psychological and physical phenomenon that occurs within a closely connected group of people, such as a household, community, or workplace. Individuals may report experiencing the same physical symptoms or events, even though none of it is actually real. Picture it like this. You and a group of friends are outside, and one of them suddenly shouts, "It's raining, but it's burning my skin." There's panic, clearly distress. Suddenly another friend feels the same sensation, convinced that acid rain is burning their skin. But before long, everyone in the group starts feeling it too, except for maybe 1 or 2 outliers who aren't affected. In reality, there was no acid rain at all, but the panic and symptoms were somehow contagious, spreading through the group even though the event never actually happened. How does this work? Well, scientists aren't entirely sure, but the phenomenon is very real and surprisingly common. There have been extensive research into group dynamics, how humans interact, and how the brain functions under high stress. It seems that fear can create a powerful bond between people, so much so that we may start to absorb the emotions and experiences of those around us. It's a frightening concept, one that has led to some truly unbelievable events. Mass hysteria has been connected to everything from the Salem witch trials to suicide cults. When exposed to fear and anxiety, our minds can take us in unpredictable and often irrational directions. To understand, just how powerful this kind of collective fear can be, we can look at the famous case of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmot's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit.
Although it was a fictional dramatization, it caused widespread panic across the U.S. Many listeners, tuning in late and missing the introduction, believed they were hearing a real-time alien invasion. Entire communities were thrown into chaos, convinced their lives were in danger. In one town, people packed up their belongings and fled their homes in fear. In another, listeners barricaded themselves in basements or armed themselves with weapons, preparing for an attack. The Mattoon incident, like the War of the Worlds broadcast, shows how quickly fear can become contagious. When an entire community is on edge, anxiety can manifest in ways that make the impossible seem all too real. But mass hysteria comes with its own set of problematic aspects, particularly the deep gender bias that has historically accompanied it. According to researchers, most of whom were men, this phenomenon was thought to be especially prevalent in women. They often relied on outdated, sexist rhetoric, suggesting that women, as the so-called weaker sex, were more impressionable, easily manipulated, and prone to fall into hysterics. In more recent studies, the lens has shifted, and the phenomenon is now referred to as mass psychogenic illness, which removes some of that gender bias and applies to a wider range of cases. However, since our case was analyzed through the misogynistic framework of mass hysteria at the time, we'll stick to that term for now. Getting back to our case, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the people of Mattoon. Most of the victims were women, though some witnesses were men. By 1944, many in the community were either off fighting in the war or heavily involved in supporting the war effort. Their lives were consumed by thoughts of violence and global conflict. While the tide had shifted in favor of the Allied forces, it was still a tense time. Loved ones were absent, and the fear that the war might come to their doorstep was very real. Although the atomic bombs were still a year away, people were already aware of technologies capable of wiping out entire communities, poison gas included. These conditions made the Mattoon incidents seem like a textbook case for a mass hysteria explanation. Though the chief of police didn't say it outright, his dismissal of the events strongly suggested that he believed hysterical women were the main reason the story had spread so quickly. Yet there are a few facts that contemporary observers feel don't quite fit the mass hysteria narrative. The first experience reported by the Kearneys seemed very real, and many have speculated that even if mass hysteria played a role later, there may have been a real person behind the initial attack. Some have tried to debunk the hysteria theory by pointing out how quickly the chief of police stepped in to reassure everyone that it was just a case of nervous women overreacting. Remarkably, only a few days after the first attack, he publicly stated that the victims were wrong, that he didn't believe them. Was the chief of police trying to dismiss the events too quickly by jumping on the mass hysteria explanation? Was he attempting to cover up a real attacker or assist in some other form of cover-up, with the factory, for example? Or perhaps he simply dismissed the reports because, in his view, the victims were all hysterical women. Another potential issue with the mass hysteria explanation is that the victims in Mattoon didn't all know each other, nor did they have any physical contact. Some didn't even realize they were victims until later. Most documented cases of mass hysteria tend to occur in smaller, tightly knit communities, where anxiety spreads through close proximity and physical interaction. In Mattoon, however, the gasser rarely struck the same street twice, and there were no cases of next-door neighbors being targeted, nor any repeat victims. If mass hysteria is the true explanation here, it might challenge how we understand the way fear spreads through a community. The mass hysteria theory has dominated the conversation. Most official studies on the Mad Gasser, particularly those conducted in the mid-20th century, leaned heavily on this explanation, often laced with layers of misogyny. But we shouldn't overlook the violence described by the victims. That's why some who support the mass hysteria theory still believe that a real event may have sparked the whole ordeal. This brings us to our third theory, that there was an actual attacker. Some proponents of this idea believe that every single case was genuine, and that a madman roamed the streets of Mattoon, evading capture. Others are more flexible, suggesting that some of the attacks were real, carried out by a single person, while other incidents may have been cases of mistaken identity or even the work of a copycat. Think back to that letter to the editor we discussed earlier. The writer referred to prowlers in the plural. Could there have been a team of individuals stalking the streets of Mattoon with some unknown motive? Perhaps it started with one person, and others followed their lead. Or more chillingly, maybe each attack was the work of completely independent individuals, all striking separately. Whether it was a single madman, a group, or a series of copycats, the idea of a real attacker adds a terrifying layer to the story. Even if you don't believe every case was a genuine attack, you have to admit that there was some strange pieces of physical evidence left behind, especially in the cords incident, which strongly suggests the involvement of a real person. There was also only one description of the gasser given, and a few other descriptions that seem to possibly support the original sighting, which does lead credence to the theory of a single real attacker. There was a rash of reports of theft in the community around that same time, which may support the idea that someone was actively trying to terrorize the citizens of Mattoon. The attacks seem to target the most vulnerable: women, children, and the elderly, which may indicate a strategic perpetrator who carefully selected their victims. Another question that remains unanswered is how exactly the gas would have been released. Some have speculated that the cloth found at the cord scene was a key clue, but others argue it might have been a red herring, suggesting it's more likely that the gas was released in a controlled fashion, perhaps using a canister or vat that allowed fumes to slowly spread through the air. The perpetrator may have worn a gas mask, which we mentioned was fairly common for people to have during World War II, making it feasible for them to release the gas without being affected by the fumes. It might sound far-fetched now, but Mattoon was an industrial city in the 1940s, and with the war effort in full swing, toxic gases would have been accessible. Someone with the right knowledge could have used these substances for nefarious purposes. With the doors and windows shut, the gas could have easily seeped into homes, leaving the residents caught completely off guard. But we have to ask ourselves, would a real person continue with these attacks once the media became so heavily involved? Would they really risk being caught with so many on high alert? This might explain why the attacks stopped as suddenly as they began, only 2 weeks after the first report. It's possible the attacker realized the danger of being caught and simply stopped and vanished. Theories about a real perpetrator faded as quickly as the events themselves, but in recent years the idea has gained new traction. For modern true crime enthusiasts, the concept of a mass gas attack doesn't seem so far-fetched. But let's step into the shoes of a 1944 detective. This was an era before anyone had heard of a serial killer, when crimes like stalking and other offenses against women were often not taken seriously, and the psychology of perpetrators yet to be studied. It's no surprise that people in the 1940s struggled to believe that someone could commit these seemingly random acts, possibly for nothing more than a thrill. Fast forward a few decades, and a series of similar attacks today wouldn't seem so implausible. We know that people engage in bizarre and dangerous behavior for no clear reason, and all too often, victims aren't believed. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easier to see how such events could unfold, even if they seemed unbelievable at the time. However, the abrupt end of the attacks, without warning or explanation, remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case, and it likely contributed to the final theory, that something paranormal was at play. If you venture into the far reaches of the internet, you'll find no shortage of conspiracy theories. Some, inevitably, point to aliens. The 1940s saw a surge in UFO sightings, and according to these proponents, the gas attacks were part of an alien experiment, designed to study the effects on humans and possibly grant extraterrestrials easier access to our world. Once their tests were complete, the aliens supposedly lost interest and moved on, leaving little Mattoon behind. Some even suggest that demonic spirits were responsible. If you tuned into our previous series on dark folklore, you might recognize elements of the Mad Gasser story that align with classic folklore figures, like the Mothman. For believers in this theory, the sudden end to the gas attacks proves that an evil entity, or perhaps a witch casting a spell, was attempting to gain control of the community through fear. As fantastical as that sounds, other mass hysteria events have been framed in similar terms. Some have even speculated that it was the work of a vengeful ghost or spirits, perhaps someone wronged by the community, seeking revenge while many of its protectors were away at war. While these theories make for compelling stories, there isn't a shred of physical evidence or even primary accounts to support them. As far as we know, no one in Mattoon reported seeing an alien or evil spirit at the time. Of course, some argue that these entities are undetectable, which is why proving such theories is nearly impossible. So, where do your beliefs lie? Are you convinced this was a classic case of mass hysteria, where fear spread like wildfire, feeding off the anxieties of a close-knit community? Or do you think an evil spirit somehow possessed the town, casting a dark shadow over Mattoon? Perhaps you believe the diesel engine company was involved in a cover-up with the chief of police, and those gases really did drift into town, poisoning people. Or maybe, like many today, you find yourself somewhere in the middle, that there was a real attacker hiding in plain sight, striking fear into the community. But as the story grew, so did the terror, and people began to project their wartime and paranormal fears onto the events, fueling the flames. Before long, it became an inferno, one strangely, that was snuffed out as quickly as it had started. Whatever the true explanation may be, it's clear that no definitive evidence will emerge to put every other theory to rest. There will always be unanswered questions, and we'll be left with incomplete solutions. Perhaps that's the answer to the question we began with. Why does this mystery continue to capture our imagination? What is it about the mad Gasser of Mattoon that still sparks endless theories? It's the unknown, the unsettling possibility that maybe, in their own ways, all four theories hold a piece of the truth. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. For information on any of our spooky season adventures, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to use the promo code HauntedTalks, all one word, at checkout to save 15% on most of our experiences. We'd love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, all at Haunted Walk. And if you're enjoying the episodes, we'd ask you to rate and review the show wherever you listen, and to suggest Haunted Talks to friends and family who love that spooky content. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.